On live television, Mike Huckabee mocked Jasmine Crockett's faith. He laughed, the crowd chuckled, and it looked like she had been humiliated. But then she rose, her voice steady, and delivered one line from the Bible that froze every soul in the room. The laughter died, the power shifted, and Mike Huckabee stood paralyzed. What happened next turned a simple debate into a battle for dignity. Stay, because the twist that followed will shake you. The studio lights blazed hot and sharp, flooding the stage with a glare that made every twitch of a smile impossible to hide. The red signal above the camera blinked on, and with it the weight of millions of eyes pressed into the room. Mike Huckabee leaned into his chair, his lips curling into a grin that was more blade than smile. His voice, slow and heavy with condescension, filled the air as he mocked the meaning of faith. The laughter came instantly, rolling out from the audience in jagged bursts. Some leaned back in their seats, others slapped their knees, carried away by the arrogance on display. But not everyone laughed. A woman near the aisle pressed her palm to her chest, her face tightening with unease. In the third row, a veteran in a faded jacket leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The contrast between amusement and discomfort split the room in two. Jasmine Crockett did not move. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her eyes locked on Mike Huckabee. She did not flinch when the laughter swelled, nor when the host forced a smile to smooth over the tension. Instead, she breathed in slowly, a breath so deliberate the microphone carried it across the silent corners of the studio. The stillness drew attention like a magnet. Then it happened, the first shock, sharper than the laughter that came before. A stagehand behind the curtain dropped a clipboard with a crack that startled the front rows. The sound cut straight through the smug rhythm of Mike Huckabee's laughter. Heads turned. The room trembled on the edge of something shifting, something no one could stop. Mike Huckabee tapped the desk, convinced the silence belonged to him. He mistook the pause for power, his grin widening as if the crowd was firmly in his grasp. But the camera zoomed closer, catching the flicker in his eyes, an almost imperceptible twitch that betrayed the truth. He was waiting. He was daring her to speak. Jasmine Crockett pushed her chair back. The scrape of its legs against the stage floor cut through the air like a blade. The audience gasped, the control room erupted in whispers, and the host tried to interject, "Perhaps we should move to," but his voice was drowned in the silence that followed. Silence so heavy it felt like the room had forgotten how to breathe. She rose to her feet. The lights found her face, clear and unyielding. She looked at Mike Huckabee, then at the audience, and finally straight into the camera. Her voice carried steady and calm, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. "Let any among you who is without sin cast the first stone." The laughter that had filled the room seconds earlier collapsed into stunned silence. Every eye froze on her. The veteran in the third row straightened, his jaw set in approval. The woman by the aisle whispered something under her breath as if in prayer. Mike Huckabee's smirk vanished. His lips pressed tight, his color drained. And then, like dry timber catching flame, the silence broke. Applause burst out, sharp and furious, spreading across the room until the sound became a roar. The stage flipped in an instant. The man who thought he owned the night now stood exposed, speechless beneath the very faith he had mocked. Jasmine Crockett did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stood, steady and firm, her words hanging heavy over the room. And the audience knew this was not just entertainment. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The echo of the applause had not yet faded when the silence came crashing back, heavier than before. The studio felt like a church after a thunderstorm, every face caught between awe and disbelief. The cameras panned across the crowd, revealing eyes wide, mouths half open, and hands still hovering mid-clap. Nobody wanted to move too soon. Nobody wanted to miss what would happen next. Mike Huckabee shifted in his chair, his smirk gone, his jaw tight as stone. For the first time that night, he looked cornered. His fingers drummed against the desk in a rhythm that betrayed nerves he could not hide. The man who mocked faith only minutes ago now sat under the weight of it, trapped in a silence he had not expected. His eyes darted toward the host, desperate for rescue. The host cleared his throat. forcing a smile that no longer fit the moment. "Well, that was certainly a strong perspective," he said, his words stumbling over each other. But the audience was not looking at him. They were locked on Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, her face unshaken. The control room whispered frantically, voices crackling in headsets, arguing whether to cut to commercial or ride the storm. Then from the back row, a man's voice cut through the tension. "Amen," he called out, firm and resonant. Heads turned, and suddenly more voices joined, soft at first, then growing. "That's right. Speak it." The ripple turned into a wave, the crowd alive not with laughter now, but with conviction. The very audience that moments earlier had mocked now leaned into her words as if the scripture had unlocked something buried inside them. Mike Huckabee raised his hand, trying to claw back the floor. "Let us not turn this into a sermon," he said sharply, his voice pitching higher than before. But the words only highlighted his discomfort. The audience was not with him anymore, and he knew it. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling just enough for the cameras to catch it. Jasmine Crockett did not sit down. She let the energy in the room settle, her silence commanding more than any argument could. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured, almost gentle. "Faith is not a punchline. It is the reason families survive nights when the bills cannot be paid, or mornings when a loved one does not come home. It is not for mockery. It is for strength." Hell. The room fell still again, but this time it was not shock, it was reverence. Some in the audience nodded, others whispered agreement. The control room director leaned into his mic, his voice hushed but urgent. "Stay on her. Do not cut." The cameraman zoomed closer, framing her against the glare of the lights, her figure firm and centered while Mike Huckabee shrank against the shadows at his side. The host tried once more to regain control, his voice quivering. "We should perhaps move on to policy," he said, but nobody wanted to move on. Everyone in the room and everyone watching at home wanted to see where this confrontation would go. And deep inside, a dangerous question began to rise. If Jasmine Crockett could flip the stage with one verse, what would she do next? The studio had turned. The crowd that once laughed now leaned toward Jasmine Crockett, their applause still echoing like aftershocks. For a moment, it felt as if she had seized the night, wrestled it out of the hands of her opponent, and claimed it as her own. But power, once shaken, rarely goes quietly. Mike Huckabee sat stiff in his chair, lips pressed tight, his eyes darting between the host and the cameras. He looked less like a man humbled and more like a man plotting. His hand moved to the stack of notes in front of him, shuffling them with unnecessary force, the paper snapping like whips under the lights. Then he leaned toward the host, whispering something off mic, his jaw tense, his words too quick for the audience to catch. The host nodded nervously, eyes widening just enough for the cameras to betray him. Something was about to change. "Let us be clear," Mike Huckabee said suddenly, his voice louder, sharper, as if he had found a new weapon. "Jasmine Crockett is not defending faith. She is exploiting it for politics, for attention, for her own image." He let the words hang in the air, calculated, baiting the crowd into doubt. Murmurs stirred in the audience, some shaking their heads, others uncertain. The moment that had belonged entirely to Jasmine Crockett now trembled under fresh fire. The host cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Perhaps we should move to another topic," he suggested, but the control room stayed locked on the tension, refusing to cut. A producer's voice whispered through headsets, "Do not move. This is what people came for." Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She leaned forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. "If defending the dignity of millions who live their faith every single day is exploitation, then perhaps you should ask why you are so afraid of their voices." The audience broke into applause again, but this time there was hesitation, as if they sensed more was lurking beneath the surface. Because there was. In the shadows behind the curtain, a young production assistant held a phone close to his chest. On the screen glowed a message thread, half hidden but dangerous. It revealed what some already suspected, that Mike Huckabee's team had walked into the studio with a plan to provoke, to ridicule, and to trap Jasmine Crockett on live television. The assistant's hands shook, his eyes flicking between the glowing screen and the stage, as if deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. Meanwhile, the cameras caught another telling sign, Mike Huckabee's hand trembling ever so slightly as he raised a glass of water. His eyes gave him away, not fear, but calculation. He was not finished. He was regrouping. The mockery, the ridicule, the smirk, they had only been the opening act. The host tried again to smooth the edges, offering a new policy question, but the words fell flat. The tension in the studio had shifted. It was no longer about one insult or one verse. It was about control, about which voice would own the stage by the end of the night. The audience felt it, the crew felt it, and millions at home felt it too. And then came the look. Mike Huckabee leaned back, turned his eyes toward Jasmine Crockett, and let the smallest smile return, not the broad grin of arrogance, but the tighter, colder smile of a man who still had cards to play. The crowd noticed. The control room noticed. And so did she. The night was far from over. What if the mockery was never just a careless remark, but the first step in a plan laid long before the cameras turned on? The roar of applause still echoed faintly when Mike Huckabee struck back. His voice, once playful with mockery, now sharpened like a blade drawn under bright lights. He leaned toward the microphone, papers rustling in his hand, the sound harsh in the charged silence. With practiced calm, he began to speak, not of faith itself, but of numbers, trends, and cold statistics. Church attendance is down, he declared, his tone heavy with authority. Surveys show that Americans no longer trust leaders who wave scripture in front of cameras. Polls prove that people are tired of performances. They are tired of being manipulated. The words cut through the studio, designed not only to wound Jasmine Crockett, but to infect the minds of millions watching at home. They were not facts, they were weapons, sharpened with cynicism, wrapped in the illusion of truth. For a heartbeat, the audience stirred. A murmur rippled through the crowd like the first tremor of an earthquake. Doubt had entered the room. Jasmine Crockett did not interrupt. She did not roll her eyes or shift in her seat. She sat still, steady, her gaze locked on the man across from her. Her silence was not weakness, it was steel. Yet inside the hearts of those listening, a storm brewed. Older viewers at home, those who had clung to faith through wars, recessions, and funerals, felt the sting of his words. He was not only challenging Jasmine, he was challenging them, questioning the very dignity of their belief. The camera zoomed in on Mike Huckabee's face. He grew bolder, layering numbers upon numbers, building what he thought was an unshakable wall. Each statistic, each poll, each twisted fact became another brick in his fortress. And with every sentence, his grin returned, wider, more smug, as if he had pulled the crowd back under his spell. But cracks were already forming. A woman in the front row crossed her arms, shaking her head. A man whispered sharply to his neighbor, his voice trembling with anger. In the control room, the director leaned forward and muttered, "Let him talk. He is tightening his own noose." The cameramen obeyed, their lenses fixed on the subtle tremor in his hand as he lifted a glass of water. Jasmine Crockett waited. She knew what he was doing. These statistics were not truth, they were shadows, carefully placed to make her look like a fraud. She let the silence stretch, every second making the air heavier. The audience leaned in, waiting for her to break. But she did not. She would not. When she finally moved, it was not with haste, but with precision. Her hand touched the edge of the table. Her eyes swept the crowd, then locked onto the camera. She had not spoken a word yet, but the audience already sensed that her answer would not come in numbers. It would come in truth, in fire, in something deeper than any poll could measure. And as Mike Huckabee droned on, convinced he had won the moment, a quiet certainty took hold. The weapons he wielded would soon turn against him. The numbers kept pouring from the mouth of Mike Huckabee like stones tumbling down a mountain. Each statistic sounded precise, each poll carefully chosen, each phrase meant to hammer doubt deeper into the minds of the audience. To an untrained ear, it sounded convincing. But to those who listened closely, the rhythm was off. His words were too polished, too rehearsed, too sharp around the edges. The audience began to shift in their seats. A woman in the second row frowned, her arms folding tight across her chest. A man near the back shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath. The laughter that had once supported him was gone. In its place came the low hum of disapproval, the kind that spreads quietly until it takes over a room. The cameras caught it all. They lingered on the furrowed brows, the tight jaws, the crossed arms. The control room director whispered, "Stay wide, show the cracks. America needs to see this." And America did. Millions watching at home saw a man trying to bury his opponent in numbers, but instead burying himself under the weight of his own arrogance. Jasmine Crockett did not interrupt. She let the silence between his words expand, stretching like a rope pulled too tight. Her calm became its own weapon. Each second she remained quiet only magnified the desperation in his voice. For the first time, the mask of certainty slipped from Mike Huckabee's face. His hand trembled as he turned a page. He blinked too often, as if fighting back the pressure of lights that suddenly felt hotter than fire. Then came the spark. From the left side of the studio, a voice rang out firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "That is not true!" The words hit the air with the force of a hammer. The crowd gasped, heads turning. A middle-aged man stood, his face red with anger. "You twist numbers to hide your lies," he said, his voice quivering but strong enough to carry. Security moved toward him, but the cameras had already captured the moment. The audience stirred again, louder this time. Whispers grew into murmurs, murmurs into sharp voices of dissent. The fortress Mike Huckabee thought he had built with statistics was cracking before his eyes. His smirk returned for a brief second, but it was thin, brittle, a mask no longer convincing anyone. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, finally breaking her silence. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. When people twist numbers, it is because they fear the truth. Faith is not measured in surveys. It is measured in how we treat each other when no one is watching. The room shifted again. Applause rippled, stronger this time, breaking the last thread of control he thought he held. Mike Huckabee tried to interrupt, but his words stumbled, caught between anger and panic. His eyes darted to the host, to the cameras, then back to her. He was no longer in command. He was exposed. The cracks in the mask had widened. And everyone, those in the studio, those watching at home, those who had laughed at the start, could see the truth. Mike Huckabee was losing the room. The storm inside the studio had not passed. If anything, it had only grown heavier. Mike Huckabee sat taller now, his voice steadier, his smile thin but deliberate. The earlier stumble seemed to fuel a new kind of fire. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, his tone sharp as he hurled the accusation straight at her. "Jasmine Crockett is not defending faith," he declared, his words cutting through the thick air. "She is exploiting it. She uses scripture as a shield to gain sympathy, to play the victim. That is not courage, it is theater." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some crossed their arms, anger flashing in their eyes. Others whispered uneasily, shaken by the audacity of his claim. It was a dangerous play, and he knew it. The cameras caught every twitch of his lips, every calculated pause, every jab meant to twist the knife deeper. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her eyes fixed on him, her silence more powerful than any interruption. She had learned long ago that not every strike deserved an immediate counter. Sometimes the most dangerous move was patience. The audience leaned in, searching her face, waiting for her response. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the air. A man in the audience, silver-haired and weary-eyed, stood to his feet. "You mock her, but you mock us too," he shouted, his voice trembling yet unshakable. "Faith carried my family when I buried my son. Do not call it theater." The studio froze. The cameras swung toward him, capturing the raw pain etched on his face. The moment was undeniable, unplanned, and devastating. The crowd erupted applause, shouts, a wave of support that drowned out Huckabee's smirk. For the first time, his mask cracked fully. He tried to recover. "I did not mean," he stammered, but his voice faltered. The host's forced smile slipped entirely, his hands tightening around his cards. The control room buzzed with frantic whispers. "Do we cut?" "No. Hold it. This is history." Behind the curtain, a production assistant clutched a headset, his face pale. The feed in his ear was unmistakable strategist backstage, laughing coldly, pushing the script further. Do not let her breathe. Mock the faith again. Break her down in front of millions. The assistant's hands shook as he glanced toward the stage. This was no debate, it was a trap. Jasmine Crockett finally rose, her voice quiet but carrying across the storm. Faith is not theater. It is the strength of a mother when she buries her child. It is the hope of a veteran who still believes in this country. It is the light that keeps us alive when everything else has turned dark. End of 74. The crowd erupted again, this time louder, fiercer, the kind of applause that shook the cameras on their stands. Mike Huckabee sat frozen, his smile gone, his eyes darting nervously toward the wings of the stage. He knew the control was slipping. He knew they all had heard too much. And as the roar filled the studio, one question hung in the air like a blade. If mocking her faith was only the beginning, then what else had been planned in the shadows, and who would be silenced next? Behind the velvet curtain, away from the blinding lights of the cameras, the truth began to leak like poison. A young production assistant pressed his headset tighter against his ear, his brow drenched in sweat. At first, it was nothing more than static, the ordinary hum of a live broadcast. But then the words cut through, cold, deliberate, dripping with intent. Push her harder. Mock the faith again. Do not let her breathe. The assistant froze. His heart thudded so loud he thought the microphone would pick it up. These were not stray remarks, not casual chatter. They were commands, barked out with the confidence of men who believed no one would ever hear them. Commands designed to break Jasmine Crockett, not with argument, but with cruelty. He listened harder, every muscle in his body trembling. Call her weak, twist her words, break her on live television. The voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of strategy rooms and smoke-filled meetings where ordinary people were treated as pawns. This was not a debate. This was a trap. On stage, Mike Huckabee adjusted his tie and leaned back, his face composed but his eyes darting toward the wings. It was as if he knew the script by heart. The audience saw only a politician regaining his footing. But behind the curtain, the assistant saw something darker, a playbook written to humiliate, to crush dignity itself. He gripped his phone, fumbling to switch on the recorder. His fingers shook, slick with sweat, but he managed to capture the feed. Every word that spilled into his ear made his chest tighter. These men were not simply mocking faith, they were mocking the millions who held onto it as their last thread of hope. They were mocking the very foundation that carried families through funerals, wars, and nights when the bills could not be paid. The assistant's throat ached with rage. He thought of his own mother, her hands clasped in prayer after his father lost his job, whispering verses that kept the family afloat. And now, here were men laughing, turning that sacred faith into a weapon for television ratings. His stomach churned. He wanted to rip the headset off, storm the stage, and shout the truth. But he froze, torn between duty and conscience. Out in the studio, the crowd shifted restlessly. They could not hear the whispers, but they sensed something was wrong. The air was too heavy, the tension too sharp. Jasmine Crockett stood calm, unaware of the venom being poured just feet away, her composure making the trap look even crueler. The assistant clutched the recording to his chest, his pulse racing. He knew this was bigger than a debate. If the whispers reached the world, they would expose not just Mike Huckabee, but the machinery behind him, the planners, the strategists, the men who believed they could script humiliation and call it democracy. And in that suffocating silence behind the curtain, the young man realized the truth. The real battle was no longer on the stage. It was in the shadows, carried by whispers that could either stay hidden or set the nation on fire. The whispers behind the curtain never reached the studio floor, but the energy in the room shifted as if some unseen current had begun to hum. The audience leaned forward in their seats, restless, unsettled. The earlier laughter was gone, replaced by a tension that coiled tighter with every word Mike Huckabee spoke. He raised his voice, attempting to regain authority, but the weight of suspicion already pressed against him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his tone firm but brittle at the edges, "do not be deceived. Jasmine Crockett plays with your emotions. She hides behind scripture, but in reality, she is just another politician who wants your vote, not your faith. The words struck the air like stones, but this time the stones did not land. Murmurs spread across the studio, rising from corner to corner. A woman in the third row shook her head sharply. "That is not true," she whispered to the man beside her, her voice picked up faintly by the microphones. A veteran near the aisle clenched his fists, his jaw set, his chest rising and falling with restrained anger. Then came the first rupture. A middle-aged woman stood, her face flushed with emotion. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice cracking with both rage and sorrow. "Faith saved me when my husband died. Faith is no stage prop. You do not get to mock that." The studio gasped, the camera snapping instantly toward her. Security hesitated, unsure whether to silence her or let the moment breathe. The control room director hissed into his headset, "Stay on her, let America see this." Mike Huckabee froze, his mouth half open, caught off guard. For the first time, the mask of control slipped completely. He raised his hands in protest, his words stumbling. I meant no disrespect. But the crowd was no longer listening. The tide had shifted. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her gaze sweeping across the audience as if to draw strength from every face. She did not rush to speak. Instead, she allowed the voices of ordinary people to rise, to fill the chamber with truth louder than statistics. Another man stood, his voice steady and firm. "You are wrong, Huckabee. We are not props. We are believers, and we are tired of being used." The applause that followed was thunderous. It was not polite nor hesitant. It was raw, explosive, a roar that shook the rafters and rattled the cameras. For the first time, the people inside the studio were no longer passive watchers. They had become participants in the battle. Mike Huckabee glanced nervously at the wings of the stage, his eyes betraying panic. He knew the whispers in the headset would demand he push harder, that he mock again, that he regain control. But the audience had awakened. The very weapon he thought he could wield, public opinion, was slipping from his grip like sand through his fingers. Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her voice quiet yet commanding enough to cut through the noise. "Faith belongs to the people, not to politicians who twist it, not to anyone who treats it as a tool. It is ours, and no one can take that from us." The applause surged again, louder, more defiant, more certain. And in that roar, one truth became clear. The audience was no longer Huckabee's. The studio buzzed with restless energy, applause still echoing from the voices of ordinary people who had risen to confront Mike Huckabee. But behind the curtain, the young production assistant's hands trembled as he clutched his phone. The recording on his screen was no longer a whisper. It was evidence. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing play. The sound bled into the studio feed, faint at first, then louder, until it filled the speakers. "Push her harder. Mock the faith again. Do not let her breathe." The words slammed into the air like thunder. The audience froze. The host turned white, his mouth hanging open, his cue cards slipping from his hand. For a heartbeat, silence consumed the studio, the silence of revelation, of betrayal made plain. Then the wave hit. Gasps erupted, followed by angry shouts. "What is this?" someone cried. Another voice shouted, "Is this a setup?" The crowd shifted like a storm, their murmurs swelling into a roar of outrage. The control room erupted in chaos. "Kill the feed! No, keep it rolling!" Voices barked through headsets. Camera zoomed, capturing the faces of a crowd that had just realized they were part of something far darker than a debate. Mike Huckabee lurched forward, his face flushed crimson. That is fake," he stammered, his hands slicing the air as if to swat away the evidence. "It is doctored audio, lies, do not believe it." His voice cracked under the weight of his own denial. But the audience did not buy it. A woman in the front row shouted, "We heard it with our own ears." A man rose to his feet, trembling with fury. "You planned this. You wanted to humiliate her." The cameras caught every second. The fury etched on their faces now beamed into living rooms across the nation. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, her movements calm, deliberate, unshaken. She did not match his anger with anger. She let the evidence speak louder than any accusation could. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and devastating. When the truth leaks, it does not whisper, it roars. The words landed with the force of a gavel. The audience exploded in applause, a thunderous sound that drowned out Mike Huckabee's desperate protests. Some stood on their feet, clapping, shouting, chanting her name. Phones rose high, recording, broadcasting the moment instantly to the outside world. The studio was no longer a stage. It had become a courtroom, a rally, a reckoning. Mike Huckabee pounded the desk, his voice cracking into rage. "This is a smear. You are being manipulated." But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the wings of the stage, searching for rescue that would not come. The mask had shattered. The control room director whispered hoarsely, "It is out now. We cannot put this back." And as the chaos swelled, applause, shouts, accusations, the roar of voices, the camera pulled wide, capturing the storm in its full fury. If a single leak could shake one studio to its core, what would happen when the entire nation heard it? The audio leak did not just echo inside the studio, it detonated. One moment, the debate felt tense. The next, it felt like a trial broadcast to an entire nation. Phones shot up in every direction, recording, streaming, multiplying the evidence that no one could deny. In living rooms across America, the words thundered from television sets. Push her harder, mock the faith again, break her on live TV. The effect was immediate. Elderly couples watching from kitchen tables exchanged stunned looks. Veterans clutched their hands into fists, memories of broken promises and hollow speeches flashing in their minds. Pastors across the South froze mid-sermon as their phones buzzed with the clip. Families who had sat in silence during funerals, during nights of unpaid bills, felt their trust insulted, betrayed, mocked for the entertainment of power. Inside the network headquarters, chaos reigned. Executives barked orders while lawyers argued about lawsuits, liability, and damage control. A producer slammed his palm on the desk, shouting, "It's too late, it's everywhere." An engineer ran waveforms across a screen, confirming what the world already suspected. The leak was genuine. By the time the words "do not let her breathe" pulsed across Twitter feeds and Facebook timelines, there was no pulling it back. Mike Huckabee lashed out like a man cornered. He released a statement within minutes, calling the audio fabricated, a smear campaign. His voice, once calm, now cracked with desperation, branding the uproar as nothing but a mob manipulated by lies. A second statement arrived hours later, promising lawsuits, calling the network corrupt, blaming enemies in the shadows, but the people had already heard too much. Then came the hammer blow. A second clip surfaced, shorter, sharper, dripping with cold intent. Make her crack, mock the faith again. The repetition left no doubt. This was no slip of the tongue, it was strategy, pure and cruel. The reaction was volcanic. Hashtags exploded. Talk radio blazed with fury. Call lines to the network jammed, overloaded with voices of outrage. Jasmine Crockett finally stepped to a microphone, not with rage, but with the calm of someone who knew the truth does not need to shout. She looked into the cameras as if she were speaking directly into the homes of millions. Her words came clear, steady, unshakable. Faith is not a toy for politics. It is not a shield for ratings or a weapon for humiliation. Faith belongs to the people who whisper prayers when their children are sick, to the veterans who still believe in this country, to the families who hold hands at the grave. It belongs to you, not to those who think they can twist it for their gain. Tonight you heard the truth and it was not whispered. It roared. The reaction was instant. Applause filled the studio, raw and defiant. Some audience members were on their feet, tears cutting down their faces, shouting her name. Social media caught fire with clips of her speech, meshing alongside the damning leaks. Across the country, living rooms, churches, and veterans' halls pulsed with the same thought. Someone had finally stood up, not just for themselves, but for all of them. Mike Huckabee sat rigid at his desk, fury etched deep across his face. His protests were drowned in the noise, his denials sounding thinner with each breath. He slammed a fist on the table, demanding order, but the storm had already passed him by. The mask was gone, replaced by the raw image of a man caught in the act. The network scrambled. Ministers gathered outside the studio. Reporters sprinted to telephones with eyes wide in disbelief. In the control room, a producer whispered what everyone already knew. "We cannot contain this. The dam is broken." "En mai." And as the camera panned wide, capturing the chaos, the roar of the people, the trembling of power, the collision of dignity and deceit, a question loomed, larger than the lights, larger than the stage. If a single leak could shatter one night, what would happen when the entire nation demanded justice by morning? By dawn, the leak was no longer just a scandal. It was a wildfire racing across the nation. Television screens in diners flickered with looping headlines. Radios blared the audio clip between country songs and weather updates. Phones buzzed in pews, in factory lines, in waiting rooms, carrying the same voice that had whispered from the shadows, "Push her harder, mock the faith again, break her on live TV." In small towns, men in work boots shook their heads, their coffee cooling untouched on the counter. Pastors looked down at their sermons, unable to pretend that politics had not invaded their pulpits. Veterans sitting in American Legion halls clenched their jaws, recognizing the same arrogance that had dismissed them after wars were over. The outrage was not limited to one group. It ran like an electric current through the veins of the country. Capitol Hill stirred like a nest prodded by fire. Some lawmakers called for immediate investigations, their voices thundering in corridors already thick with cameras. Others hedged, fumbling with carefully worded statements, afraid to choose a side. "If this leak is true," one senator muttered on live television, "then it strikes at the very core of public trust." The words rang hollow, but the fear behind them was unmistakable. Meanwhile, media outlets scrambled. Morning shows cut to panels of analysts, voices raised, fingers jabbing at screens that displayed poll numbers plunging in real time. Conservative hosts tried to pivot, calling it a smear, but their calls were drowned by the echo of the recording itself. Every time they spoke, the words played again, colder, more damning, impossible to erase. On the streets, the people were already moving. Outside the studio where it began, crowds gathered with signs scrawled overnight. "Faith is not a weapon. We believe Jasmine." Ministers linked arms, leading chants that blended prayer with protest. Car horns blared in support, and strangers exchanged nods, bound by the recognition that they had all been mocked together. Mike Huckabee, once untouchable, now fought for air. His press conference was scheduled hastily, set against a backdrop of flags meant to signal authority. He entered with a forced smile, flanked by aides, whispering nervously. "This is political theater," he insisted, voice clipped, eyes darting. "The leak is false, manipulated by enemies who want to silence me." But even as he spoke, the crowd outside roared louder, their chants seeping through the walls, drowning his words. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She appeared not in a polished studio, but on the steps of a community church. Her coat hung heavy in the morning chill, her hair damp with mist, but her eyes carried a steady fire. Reporters thrust microphones forward, but she did not shout. She spoke plainly, her voice measured the way a neighbor might speak across a fence. Faith belongs to families. It belongs to those who work, who grieve, who endure. It does not belong to men in back rooms who mock it for power. Last night you heard their voices. Today I ask you to raise yours. The crowd erupted, chants rolling like thunder down the street. Some wiped tears, others lifted phones to stream live, their faces lit by the glow of a woman speaking words they had longed to hear. The nation was teetering. Trust had been shaken, anger ignited, hope rekindled all at once. Across dinner tables, in newsrooms, and on the Senate floor, one question pulsed with the urgency of a beating drum. If one leak could shatter the walls of a studio, could it also crack the walls of power in Washington? Washington had not woken up, it had been jolted awake. By mid-morning, the Capitol was swarmed with cameras, each hallway echoing with the clatter of heels and the bark of questions. Senators ducked behind office doors, staffers shuffled folders with white knuckles, and every whispered conversation seemed to carry the same three words, the leak tape. Some lawmakers wasted no time in seizing the moment. They called for hearings, their voices booming with righteous fury. This is not about politics, one congressman thundered into a bank of microphones. This is about respect for the American people and their faith. His words drew cheers from the crowd gathered on the steps, waving signs that read, "We believe Jasmine." But others hedged, their words cautious, their tones dripping with calculation. A senator from the opposite party stood stiffly before the press and muttered, "If the leak is authentic, it is concerning, but we must avoid hysteria." The line was replayed across cable news with sneers and mockery. In an age where truth could be heard in seconds, hesitation looked like guilt. The media turned the fire hose full force. Morning shows replayed the clip every half hour, analysts dissecting every syllable of the strategy call. Conservative pundits tried to spin it as out of context, but their voices cracked under the weight of the raw audio. Liberal commentators declared it the most damning revelation in years. And in between, ordinary Americans called in, their voices trembling with fury or steady with faith, saying the same thing again and again: "We are tired of being mocked." Through it all, Mike Huckabee clung to defiance. His press conference played on every network, flags behind him, aides flanking him, his jaw tight with anger. "This leak is false," he barked. "It is a smear designed to destroy me." But even as he spoke, chants from outside the building bled into the microphones. Faith is not a weapon. His face hardened, his voice rose, and the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She did not stand behind polished podiums or flags. She appeared on church steps, at community centers, her hands clasped with mothers, veterans, and ministers. She spoke plainly, without notes, her words landing with the weight of lived experience. You heard them laugh at what we hold sacred. You saw their plan to turn faith into a punchline. But faith is not theirs to use. It is yours to carry, yours to protect. Her voice was carried live on networks that only days before had dismissed her. Clips of her speeches spread like sparks. An old woman wiping tears as she clasped her hand, a veteran nodding slowly, a young man whispering, "She is speaking for us." She was no longer just defending herself. She was becoming a vessel for the anger, the hope, the dignity of millions. But with each word she spoke, the pressure mounted. Allies warned her privately, "They will come after you harder now." Commentators speculated about her future, her safety, her strength to withstand what was coming. And in the halls of power, men who had long mocked behind closed doors began to whisper louder, plotting their next move. The storm had only begun. And as Washington split between silence and fury, one truth grew impossible to deny. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a target. She was becoming a symbol. The night after the leak, America did not sleep. Radios hummed with anger, televisions replayed the damning audio, and conversations over dinner tables carried the same fire. They mocked our faith. But at sunrise, the fight shifted. The counterattack came swift and merciless, like a blade drawn in the dark. By dawn, headlines across sympathetic networks turned the story on its head. Anchors leaned forward, their faces grave, their words laced with doubt. Did Jasmine Crockett stage this moment? One demanded. Another whispered about manufactured outrage, suggesting that the woman who had stood firm in silence had somehow orchestrated the storm herself. The leak was pushed to the margins, replaced by questions of her character. Then came the flood online. Thousands of anonymous accounts unleashed a barrage of accusations. Grainy photographs, stripped of context, resurfaced with captions designed to wound. Fabricated documents circulated, hinting at shadowy ties to donors, as if faith itself had a price tag. Even her most private words were twisted, sentences yanked from old speeches, reshaped to paint her as a hypocrite. Lies spread faster than truth, and doubt crept like smoke into the minds of those who wanted to believe the worst. Mike Huckabee's allies wasted no time fanning the flames. They filled morning talk shows, their voices slow, deliberate, heavy with feigned sorrow. "We are not questioning her faith," one said, his lips pursed. "We are questioning her honesty." Another added with a sigh, If she misled the nation once, what else is she hiding? It was an audacious inversion. Those caught mocking faith now cloaked themselves as its guardians. Yet for many viewers, the repetition of doubt became almost as powerful as proof. The assault was relentless. Newspaper columns labeled her polarizing. Commentators dissected her tone, her clothing, even the pauses in her speeches. Each detail spun as evidence of cunning. The machinery of smear did not roar, it whispered, repeated, echoed until its chorus filled the airwaves. It sought not to win, but to exhaust, to grind dignity into silence. Jasmine Crockett did not lash out. Her calm became her weapon. She appeared briefly before cameras, her expression steady, her voice unshaken. Faith is not mine to invent, she said. It belongs to those who live it. Then she walked away, leaving her enemies sputtering with accusations they could not pin down. But inside her circle, aides whispered of sleepless nights, of threats flooding in, of friends afraid to be seen standing beside her. The storm was closing in, and everyone knew it. For Americans watching, veterans, churchgoers, families who had felt their beliefs mock the spectacle was more than politics. It was a reminder of how quickly truth could be twisted, how easily dignity could be attacked. They saw themselves in her battle because they too had faced whispers meant to diminish, lies meant to shame, wounds meant to break spirit. And as the smear machine gathered speed, one chilling truth settled like frost across the nation. If they could turn faith itself into a weapon against Jasmine Crockett, then what would they unleash next? The smear did not move like chaos, it moved like choreography. Every headline, every post, every whispered rumor seemed to follow a script written long before the leak. By mid-morning, the story was no longer about the men caught mocking faith. It was about Jasmine Crockett, or rather the distorted shadow of her that the machine wanted America to see. Cable news rolled out coordinated panels. One network showed blurred images of her past, spliced together to suggest scandal. Another aired interviews with anonymous sources who questioned her sincerity. Words like divisive, untrustworthy, and opportunist pulsed across the screen in bold graphics. Even the chyron beneath her name twisted her identity. Faith under fire. Is Crockett exploiting belief? On social media, the campaign escalated. Bots and trolls pushed hashtags that painted her as a fraud. Conspiracy theories flourished, claiming she had staged the audience's outburst, that the man who shouted from the crowd was a plant. Doctored clips of her speeches surfaced, sentences spliced mid-breath to make her sound mocking instead of resolute. The truth was drowned in noise, and every minute of silence let the falsehoods multiply. Behind closed doors in Washington, the machinery was visible in sharper detail. Consultants whispered to journalists, seeding tips about her supposed ambitions. Lobbyists urged lawmakers to distance themselves, warning of backlash if they stood by her. In think tanks and strategy rooms, men in suits traded smirks, congratulating themselves for turning the fire back on her. The cruelty was not improvised, it was engineered. Through it all, Mike Huckabee reappeared, now polished and rehearsed. He no longer raged, he smirked. Sitting in a studio, he told a sympathetic host, "I never mocked anyone's faith. This has always been about truth. Jasmine Crockett is the one dividing us." The words were hollow, but they echoed because the smear machine gave them a megaphone. For ordinary Americans, the barrage was dizzying. Churchgoers saw neighbors reposting lies online. Veterans who had cheered for Jasmine Crockett now found themselves defending her in diners and workplaces. Families debated late into the night, some clinging to her words, others shaken by the drumbeat of accusation. It was not just her reputation under attack, it was the very idea of whether truth could survive the weight of coordinated deceit. And Jasmine Crockett, she did not collapse. She carried herself with a steady calm, but those closest to her saw the toll. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, her phone flooded with threats. At times, she paused before stepping into the light, taking a breath so deep it felt like a prayer. Yet when she spoke, her voice remained steady. They can mock me, they can smear me, but faith does not belong to them, and it never will. The audience at her side erupted in applause, but even as the cheers rang out, the machine churned louder, faster, colder. It had no face, no single voice, only an endless echo designed to drown her out. And as America watched the clash of one woman against a machine, a question rippled through homes, churches, and halls of power. If they could build an empire of lies to break her, then how many others had already been broken in silence? The smear machine did not sleep, and neither did Jasmine Crockett. For days, the headlines multiplied, each one sharper than the last. Crockett exploits faith. Is she lying to America? Morning anchors dissected her tone of voice. Late-night hosts mocked her pauses. Her face appeared on front pages not as a defender of dignity, but as a caricature of doubt. At first, Jasmine Crockett carried herself with her usual calm. But fatigue began to carve lines under her eyes, and her shoulders bent with the invisible weight pressing down. Friends who once stood beside her now avoided her calls. Donors hesitated. Even allies in Congress whispered warnings. Step back or they will destroy you. Each whisper felt like another brick laid on the wall, closing in. Alone in her apartment one night, she sat before the mirror. Her phone buzzed with messages, some vile, others pleading, all overwhelming. She rubbed her temples, staring at her reflection. For the first time, she wondered if the smear was working, if perhaps silence would be easier. The thought frightened her more than the attacks. And then came a knock at her door. An elderly woman stood in the hallway, wrapped in a worn shawl. Her eyes carried the weight of decades, but they shone with clarity. I had to see you, she said softly. When my husband died, I thought I had no reason to keep living. But when I heard you speak of faith, I remembered why I pray. Do not let them take that from us. She pressed a trembling hand over Jasmine Crockett's. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered, "We need you to keep standing." The words cut deeper than any smear. They reminded her that she was not only fighting for herself, she was carrying the weight of countless families, veterans, mothers, and elders whose voices were too often silenced. The very next day, Jasmine Crockett walked into a live interview, one designed as a trap. The host peppered her with questions loaded with venom. Did you stage the leak? Are you exploiting religion for political gain? Why should Americans trust you at all? Each question slammed against her like waves meant to drown her. Her lips parted, her eyes flickered, and for a moment the room felt the fragility of a woman standing at the edge. The crowd watching at home leaned closer, hearts pounding. Was this it? Was this the moment she would falter, the moment the machine would claim victory? But then a voice rang out. From the back of the studio, a veteran stood and shouted, "She speaks for us!" His words cracked the air like a shot. Others rose, clapping, chanting her name. The cameras swung, capturing the eruption of support that no network had scripted. Jasmine Crockett lifted her head, her voice steady again. You can attack me, you can lie about me, but you cannot erase the truth of the people standing here. The studio erupted in thunderous applause. The smear machine had pushed her to the breaking point, but instead of shattering, she had drawn strength from the very people they had tried to silence. And as the applause rolled like a wave across the nation, one question lingered in every heart. Was this the moment she was destroyed, or the moment a movement was born? The moment the veteran's voice cracked through the studio, something shifted. It was no longer about a debate, no longer about two people sparring under lights. It was about the crowd, the cameras, the nation watching with breath held tight. As Jasmine Crockett lifted her head and declared she could not be erased, her words ignited a spark that leapt beyond the studio walls. Within hours, the spark spread like wildfire. Clips of the eruption flooded social media, bouncing from phone to phone, city to city. A grandmother in Mississippi whispered to her daughter, "She is fighting for us." A factory worker in Ohio paused mid-shift to replay the video, nodding with tears streaming down his face. A pastor in Detroit tore up half his sermon and rewrote it around one line. You cannot erase the truth of the people standing here. I'm Crowds began to gather in front of city halls and churches, carrying handmade signs scrawled with words that echoed Jasmine Crockett's defiance. "We are still standing. Faith is not a weapon. She speaks for us." What began as scattered voices became chants, and what began as chants became a roar. The media could not ignore it. Helicopters hovered above rallies. Morning hosts who had once cast doubt now spoke with wide-eyed disbelief. "Something is happening out there," one anchor admitted, his voice trembling. "It feels bigger than politics." On rival networks, the panic was palpable. Pundits tried to dismiss the crowds as staged, but their voices faltered over the sight of thousands filling streets that had been empty the night before. Mike Huckabee tried to mock the movement. In a press appearance, he smirked, "Crowds come and go. Anger burns hot and then it fades." But even as he spoke, chants of "We believe Jasmine" bled through the walls of the building, picked up by his microphone, undermining every word he tried to say. His grin tightened, his eyes flickered, and for the first time he looked like a man shrinking in the shadow of something he could not control. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett chose her ground carefully. She stood on church steps, in union halls, in community centers where the air smelled of sweat and hope. She did not deliver speeches heavy with strategy. She spoke plainly, telling stories of families who had lost loved ones, of veterans who had fought wars only to return to neglect, of mothers who had prayed over empty cupboards. "This is not about me," she said again and again. "This is about you, your faith, your dignity. And if they try to silence me, they are trying to silence all of us." The people listened. More than that, they believed. Strangers clasped hands, singing hymns that rose above the noise of smear and slander. Hashtags became banners, banners became marches, marches became a movement. And in the corridors of Washington, the whispers turned to alarm. Lawmakers peered out their windows at crowds swelling like tides, asking questions no one wanted to answer. If this was only the beginning, what would the movement demand next? The flame did not flicker, it roared. What began as a spark inside a single studio now stretched across the nation, igniting streets, churches, and union halls with a force no broadcast could contain. In the heart of small towns, candles glowed in windows. In sprawling cities, chants rattled skyscraper glass. The people had carried Jasmine Crockett's words beyond the walls of television and turned them into a living fire. In Memphis, church bells rang through the night as congregations poured outside, their hymns blending with chants. In Detroit, auto workers marched shoulder to shoulder, their boots striking pavement in unison, voices booming, "Faith is not a weapon." In Dallas, veterans stood in rows with folded flags, their silence more powerful than any speech. These were not politicians or pundits. They were ordinary Americans who had decided they would no longer be mocked, no longer be silenced. News cameras captured it all, helicopters hovering above rivers of people moving through highways, drone shots of stadiums filled not with fans, but with citizens demanding dignity. Anchors who once doubted now leaned forward with awe in their voices. "This is not just a protest," one admitted, eyes wide. "This feels like an awakening." The word spread like wildfire. Awakening. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about a country rediscovering its own voice. Mike Huckabee tried to smirk through the storm. He stepped before cameras, his words laced with condescension. "Crowds chant today, but tomorrow they will go home," he declared. But even as he spoke, chants outside bled through the walls of the building. "We believe Jasmine." His smile twitched. His grip on the podium tightened. The confidence of a man once untouchable began to crumble beneath the roar of a nation he had mocked. And in the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not on grand stages, but in church basements, union halls, and streets still wet from rain. She hugged mothers whose sons had died overseas. She clasped the calloused hands of factory workers. She knelt beside elders in prayer circles that formed on courthouse steps. Her words were simple, but each carried the weight of lived truth. "This is not about me," she told them, her voice steady. "This is about you, your families, your faith, your dignity. You are the flame, and no one can put it out." Crowds erupted, tears streaming down faces that had known hardship too long. Strangers locked arms, strangers sang together. Strangers who had felt invisible suddenly felt seen. The smear machine tried to drown it in lies, but the chants only grew louder, echoing from highways to Capitol steps. And as the night sky burned with candlelight, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer the battle of one woman. This was the rising of a people long dismissed, now united by a fire that refused to die. In Washington, the whispers turned to alarm. Lawmakers peered through blinds, watching the crowds grow, their fear etched in every glance. And the question that rippled across the corridors of power was the same one whispered on the streets. If this is only the beginning of the flame, what will happen when it engulfs the halls of power themselves? The chants reached Washington before the crowds did. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to the marble halls of the Capitol, the echo of thousands of voices rolled like thunder. We believe Jasmine. We believe Jasmine. For decades, lawmakers had convinced themselves that protest was noise, that outrage faded, but this was different. The voices carried not only anger but faith, not only frustration but the unshakable weight of dignity reclaimed. Inside the Capitol, the tremor was unmistakable. Senators who once strutted now huddled in corners, their whispers sharp, their eyes darting toward windows where they could see the swelling tide below. Aides rushed with papers clutched tight, cell phones buzzing with updates from across the country. Every hallway seemed to breathe with panic. How big will this get? How long before it reaches us? Committee rooms became battlefields. Some lawmakers pounded fists on polished wood, demanding immediate hearings into the smear machine, declaring the leak a national scandal that could not be ignored. Others shrank into silence, muttering excuses about waiting for more information. But the cameras caught everything, the sweat on brows, the quiver in voices, the unmistakable fear that power itself was cracking. Reporters swarmed the corridors, their cameras flashing like lightning. "Do you stand with Huckabee or with the people?" one shouted, as a congressman froze mid-step, his mouth opening but no sound escaping. The footage aired within minutes, spreading across every network. For the public watching at home, the image was unmistakable. Washington was paralyzed. Behind closed doors, Mike Huckabee seethed. His allies urged him to double down, to strike harder, but the mask of confidence had fractured. He had mocked faith, and now faith had returned in the form of a movement too large to silence. Every chant outside his window reminded him of his mistake. He slammed his hand against the table, but the noise of one man could not drown the roar of a nation. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She stood on the Capitol steps, not cloaked in marble grandeur, but shoulder to shoulder with the people who had carried her words into fire. Her voice was calm, steady, almost prayerful, yet it carried further than any microphone inside those walls. "This is not just about politics," she declared, her eyes sweeping across veterans, mothers, elders. "This is about whether dignity has a place in our democracy. If they silence one of us, they silence all of us." The crowd erupted, chants rolling like a storm up the Capitol dome. Strangers clasped hands, elders wept openly, veterans raised flags with trembling arms. And as the sound swelled, reporters whispered that the ground beneath Washington was trembling. For the first time in years, lawmakers felt not the comfort of distance, but the weight of a people standing just outside their doors. And the question hung heavy, whispered through every marble hall. If this flame could shake the nation's capital tonight, what would happen if it refused to burn out tomorrow? The dome of the Capitol did not just echo, it trembled. Outside, chants rolled like thunder. "We believe Jasmine." Inside, the chamber was packed, cameras blinking like restless eyes, capturing every second. At one end stood Mike Huckabee, his jaw tight, his smile thin, clutching a folder of papers he claimed would bury his opponent. At the other end stood Jasmine Crockett, silent, steady, waiting for the storm to break. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mike Huckabee began, his voice sharp as glass, "this woman has fooled you. She staged the chaos, she manipulated your emotions, and she disgraced faith itself. He waved the folder in the air, shaking it for the cameras. Here is the proof. The chamber buzzed with anticipation, but when he opened it, the so-called evidence was thin, twisted quotes and grainy images, a desperate pile dressed as truth. The audience stirred. A few gasps escaped. A veteran in the gallery shook his head, his hand gripping a folded flag on his lap. He stood suddenly, voice raw. "You talk about disgrace? I buried brothers with prayer on my lips. Faith is not theater. It is survival." His words cut the air, honest and unpolished, impossible to dismiss. The chamber froze. For a moment, Mike Huckabee's smirk faltered. The host tried to intervene, banging the gavel. "Order, this is not the place." But it was too late. Murmurs swelled, cameras swung, and the gallery erupted in applause. Ordinary people, uninvited, had forced their truth into the heart of power. Mike Huckabee slammed the folder shut, shouting over the roar, "This is all staged! You are being deceived!" His voice cracked, echoing with desperation rather than authority. The more he spoke, the smaller he seemed. Jasmine Crockett lifted her head at last. She did not shout. She let silence stretch, heavy and electric, until the chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, each word deliberate, grounded, sharp. The first stone was cast when they mocked what keeps families alive. The whisper behind the curtain tried to plan a lie. But truth does not whisper. It roars. The words hung like a verdict. The chamber erupted, the noise so fierce the rafters shook. Mike Huckabee pounded the desk, but his fury was swallowed by the crowd. And as the cameras captured the moment, one question lingered, sharper than the gavel's echo. Who would cast the final stone? And would it strike the woman who stood firm, or the man who mocked a nation? The chamber had never felt so alive, nor so fragile. The walls shook with chants, applause, and gasps that came in waves. But then suddenly it all fell quiet. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, her hands steady at her sides, her eyes fixed not only on Mike Huckabee, but on the faces of every soul watching in the gallery and every screen across the nation. Her voice began softly, carrying not with volume, but with gravity. They told you lies. They mocked what you hold sacred. They believed they could reduce faith to a punchline. But there is one truth no smear machine can bury. She let the silence breathe, as if allowing the words to sink into the bones of every listener. Then she spoke the verse that had carried generations. "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The words struck like a hammer on iron. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gallery erupted applause, thundered, chairs scraped against marble, voices rose together, some crying out, others in tears, mothers clutched their children. Veterans stood with hands trembling over their hearts. Ministers bowed their heads, whispering amen through clenched lips. It was no longer just a political chamber, it was a cathedral of awakening. Mike Huckabee tried to respond, but no words came. His lips parted, his jaw tightened, yet nothing left his mouth. The folder in his hand slipped, papers scattering like ash across the floor. Cameras zoomed in mercilessly, capturing not the power he once wielded, but the emptiness of a man stripped bare before the truth. His silence became louder than any accusation. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett did not gloat. She did not smile. She stood with quiet strength, as though she knew the verse was not hers alone, but belonged to the people who had carried it through funerals, wars, and nights of despair. "The truth has always been yours," she continued, her voice resonant. "It belongs to the mother who prays for her son overseas. It belongs to the grandfather who kneels by an empty chair. It belongs to every family that has been mocked, dismissed, or ignored, and tonight that truth has spoken louder than any lie." The applause rose again, this time deeper, steadier, almost like a heartbeat sinking across the chamber. Tears streamed down the faces of strangers who clasped hands without knowing one another's names. They did not need to. They were bound by the recognition that dignity, once trampled, had now stood tall. In living rooms across the country, people sat forward in their chairs. Some whispered the verse along with her. Others wiped tears, realizing they were part of something larger than themselves. It was not about one politician or one scandal. It was about the unbreakable truth that faith, dignity, and justice cannot be silenced. And as the camera pulled wide, capturing the sight of Mike Huckabee standing frozen and Jasmine Crockett standing unshaken, one realization swept across the nation. The truth had not whispered, it had roared. And in that roar, a people who had long felt invisible finally felt free. The chamber slowly emptied, but the echo of that verse lingered like incense in the air. Outside, the chants had quieted into hymns, voices softer now, almost reverent, as if the nation itself needed to breathe after holding its voice so long. The marble steps of the Capitol glowed under the evening lights, not as monuments to power, but as witness to a night when truth had found its voice. Mike Huckabee slipped into the shadows, surrounded by aides who spoke in hushed tones, their faces pale with defeat. His power was not stripped by a vote, nor by legislation, but by something far simpler, a people who refused to be mocked. His silence in that chamber would follow him longer than any headline. Jasmine Crockett walked out into the cool night air, not with the triumph of a conqueror, but with the calm of someone who understood the weight of what had happened. She shook hands, embraced strangers, and bowed her head in prayer with those who gathered close. There was no grand speech, no declaration of victory. Only the quiet dignity of a woman who had carried the hopes of millions and placed them gently back in their hands. Across America, living rooms glowed with television light. Families who had once argued now sat in silence, reflecting. Veterans whispered to their children about sacrifice. Ministers rewrote sermons. Workers spoke of dignity over coffee cups. Something had shifted, not the laws yet, not the institutions, but the spirit of a people who realized their voices mattered. The smear machine would not vanish overnight, lies would continue to spread, and battles would still be fought, but something stronger had been born. A reminder that truth may be mocked, buried, or twisted, but it does not die. It waits. It waits until someone brave enough speaks it aloud, and then it roars until the walls shake. As Jasmine Crockett paused on the Capitol steps, she looked back once. The dome loomed above her, still trembling in the memory of what had been said. She whispered not to the cameras, not to the crowd, but to herself. The truth has spoken. And across a nation weary of noise, weary of division, those words planted themselves deep. For some, they felt like justice. For others, like healing. But for all, they felt like a beginning. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not won in silence or in shouting, but in the moment when truth is spoken and a people finally remember they are free. The story of Jasmine Crockett shows us this. Power can be staged, money can buy television airtime, but the truth can never be buried forever. The truth only needs one person brave enough to speak it. And when that voice rises, it does not just set the speaker free, it sets free an entire community longing to be heard. If one day your faith, the very thing that carries you through loss, through sleepless nights, through hardship, were mocked and turned into a joke, would you choose silence? Or would you stand up the way Jasmine Crockett did? Do we have the courage to believe that even when we are just one small voice, the truth can still shake the very walls that once seemed unbreakable? If you believe the truth must be spoken, if you believe the voices of minority communities deserve to be defended, hit like to stand with this mission. And do not forget to subscribe to Truth America Stories to follow Jasmine Crockett's journey and the stories ahead where truth, faith, and dignity of the people will always come first.